month before the first American died of the coronavirus, scientists had already designed the vaccine. In a Massachusetts lab last January 13th, Moderna researchers used the genetic sequence of the virus, made public by China, to design an mRNA molecule that teaches the immune system to recognize and neutralize it. By February, their vaccine had actually been made and shipped to the National Institutes of Health to start clinical trials. This largely unknown timeline shows that while development of the coronavirus vaccines was astonishingly rapid, approval of them was painstaking. More than 300,000 Americans died and 16 million were infected, while a nearly miraculous solution underwent testing and approval. But for sound reasons of safety and ethics, science and government did not authorize their use until now. In this darkest winter in recent history, the vaccines promise a spring. They are a triumph of the Enlightenment values of science, reason, and evidence, all now under assault in a new dark ages in which demagogues and conspiracy theorists spread disinformation and distrust. Despite various attempts to claim credit, the vaccines would not exist without international cooperation. Moderna's vaccine employs technology created by Hungarian-born scientist Katalin Karikó, and the company is run by a team of researchers and entrepreneurs from around the world. The Pfizer vaccine was created by second-generation Turkish immigrants to Germany, Uğur Şahin and Özlem Teresi, and has been pushed past the finish line by company CEO Albert Bourla, an immigrant from Greece. The pandemic of 2020 will not be the last crisis endangering humanity. What we've relearned in this traumatic year is that all we hold dear is fragile, and that science, community, and empathy light the road forward.
I'd like to now introduce our speaker for today's program. Professor Robert Miller is our speaker today. He is a professor at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University, where he teaches classes on Indian law and civil procedure. He is a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe and a judge for the Grand Ronde Tribe in Oregon and this Pascua Yaqui Tribe in Arizona, as well as several other tribes. He is an elected member of the American Philosophical Society. He has written 2 books, one, Native America, Discovered and Conquered, Thomas Jefferson, Lewis and Clark, and Manifest Destiny, published in 2006, and Reservation Capitalism, Economic Development in Indian Country, published in 2012. He also co-authored Discovering Indigenous Lands, The Doctrine of Discovery in the English Colonies. He has written dozens of law review articles and book chapters. He has spoken to conferences in over 30 states and in the United States and in Australia, Canada, England, India, and New Zealand. Professor Miller, it is our true honor to have you speak to the humanists of Greater Portland today, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you, David, and I think Dell, I think you're the person that emailed me several months ago, and Joyce, thank you too. I'm delighted to be here and chat with you. I'm a native Portlander, born and raised there, went to Woodstock Grade School, Cleveland High School, Lewis and Clark Law School, and then I taught at Lewis and Clark for 14 years as a tenured professor, and then I moved down here to Arizona State. And this is my 8th year here. So I'm sitting here, it's gonna be 80 degrees today, folks, and the sun is shining to my left here. I don't know what it's doing in Portland. I understand you had 2 inches of rain in one day, maybe like Tuesday or Wednesday, right? Oh my gosh, we haven't had it rain here since December. Anyway, that's enough bragging about Arizona, because guess what? I come back to Portland every summer because who wants to stay down here when it's 115 degrees? Anyway, I guess I'll share my screen now. I do have PowerPoints. I think you'll be able to see me in a little bullet slide on the side. I do have a lot of information to give you, and we will try to cover this today. I was asked to talk just about American Indian peoples, Indian nations, Indian cultures in American history. And if you're interested in what I'm talking about, I've given you my there's a website there. If you've never heard of SSRN, it stands for Social Science Research Network. It's free, and you can go online, and there are something like 300,000 authors with about 3 million articles that you can word search and download for free. That number there is my particular SSRN page, and I have, I think, 62 or 63 papers located there. So a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today, of course, I hope you'll buy a copy of my book later. Thank you, Helen, for the advertisement there. But if you don't, you can get a lot of stuff I've written for free through these articles at that address for SSRN. It takes you about 10 seconds to register for the site, and it's free. And like I said, you can search. So what are we talking about? When did American history start? When we got on this call about a half hour ago to test this stuff, I just mentioned this briefly, but I was involved in a process to check out high school and college casebooks, textbooks in the United States, and analyze how they address Native peoples. Are Native peoples even mentioned in our American Indian history books? And the answer is almost no, except for Thanksgiving and a couple of massacres and the 7th Cavalry and George Custer. Do you want to hear a joke? Maybe it's not appropriate for this group, but did you hear that George Custer died in an arrow shirt? I shouldn't be telling jokes like that. Anyway, let me get to some points. So how far back should one go in history? And the books that Helen mentioned of mine, my first book, and then the book I co-wrote with Aboriginal professors from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, we analyzed how international law was used by European Christian nations against all the indigenous peoples around the world. I'm writing an article right now on how Europeans divided Africa in the 1880s, and the international law that they developed it came from what I'm going to talk to you about very quickly. So the history of indigenous peoples in international law literally begins this long ago, folks. When Spain and Portugal began to fight over who controlled the Canary Islands, which are off the Iberian Peninsula, once Europeans started sailing out of sight of land, I think they literally discovered the Canary Islands in 1341, and their struggle over who could colonize it, who could exploit it, Spain or Portugal, began then. But we all know how important the Pope was in those times and how much the church was involved in even political governmental operations. And so the Pope at the time issues a papal bull. If you've ever heard of that phrase, it's an edict from the Pope, from the papacy, a papal bull, obviously, and granted the Canary Islands to Portugal to colonize it, to convert it, and to settle it. Well, as Africa was being discovered, as Portuguese explorers moved further down the west coast of Africa, subsequent popes issued more papal bulls, 1452, 1453, and then this one in 1455. I'm not going to read that to you. I've underlined a few words. Look at what the church authorized Portugal to do in Africa: invade, capture, take all the kingdoms, dominions, possessions, take all goods, reduce the people to perpetual slavery. Now, Saracens is the word they used for Muslims then, and pagans. So when I say this was a European Christian development of international law, this is exactly what it was. There's no one, I think, that disagrees with this point, that Europeans were developing international law about how to colonize the rest of the world. So folks, all these papal bulls that the Pope was issuing in the 1450s were only for Portugal, and they were mostly about Africa. And Spain felt left out of this race for colonization. And so when Columbus shows up to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand and says, I can go west and look for lands. They funded him. They sent him out under 7 contracts to look for land. The moment Columbus landed on a few islands in the Caribbean, he turned around and rushed back to Spain, and then they asked the Pope for a papal bull recognizing Spain's claims. So I'm going to show you. In 1493, the new Pope, Alexander VI, issues 4 papal bulls controlling Spanish lands, Spanish claims to land and assets and people, dominion, sovereignty, ownership over these new lands. Of course, these weren't new lands to the indigenous peoples that lived on Hispaniola and San Salvador and in Central and South America and North America. So this is a joke, isn't it? But it was an alleged transfer of governance, sovereignty, dominion. The Latin word dominion means governance and property ownership. And you can see this May of 1493 papal bull gives these lands to Spain if they had not been possessed by any previous Christian owner. So this was very much the law of Christianity, very much the law of European colonization. Now, Portugal was very unhappy with the idea that the Pope now had sort of divided the world and was giving Spain these new lands found in the West. And Portugal refused to agree to this papal bull and threatened war. And so Pope Alexander VI draws another papal bull, and he draws a line around the world, folks. If any of you have studied international history, you will run across, as I did, and I didn't understand what they meant at first. International historians call that dotted red line the line of demarcation. And you will encounter that if you start reading. And at first, I didn't even know what it was. But it's the line, and if you read the map, look right in the middle, it's the dotted line is the line Pope Alexander VI drew. Do you remember the joke we were taught that Columbus was afraid he was going to sail off the edge of the world? How stupid we were taught that. It's not even true, folks. This papal bull from 1493 drew that dotted line in the Atlantic from the North Pole to the South Pole. So the Pope knew there were poles. They knew all about this, and there's the dotted line. But that's the line that Portugal refused to comply with. So look on the left side of my map, and you'll see that Spain and Portugal held a treaty at the city of Tordesillas in Spain, and they signed a treaty the next year, and they agreed to move that line about 500 miles to the west. Portugal, they knew about the lands in the New World. They knew Spain had just landed, at least in the Caribbean. And so, folks, what language do they speak in Brazil to this day? Where was Portugal's one colony in the New World? Well, it was Brazil. And look at that. It was based on this international law of the papal bulls, as Spain and Portugal then agreed to it. But you can see that Asia and Africa was reserved for Portugal. And this led to the fight with England and France and Holland because they wanted these riches too. They wanted empire. And so I'm skipping now about 400 years of history to arrive to the United States. But I'm literally telling you that this history was well known by our founding fathers, by Washington and Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, etc. Let me tell you, in 1786, don't forget that most of these gentlemen were lawyers, right? Alexander Hamilton represented the state of New York in a lawsuit against Massachusetts about the borders, the borderline between the two states. His number one exhibit for the trial was a chart of law as it had been applied in the United States, and he started with these papal bulls I just talked to you about. So it's not just me dreaming this up, that these papal bulls influenced how the United States dealt with indigenous nations and indigenous peoples, and how it's part of American law to this very day. So let's jump several hundred years ahead. I want to show you something that I think is about as ugly a language as you can encounter. This was the American policy towards indigenous peoples and Indian nations probably until about the 1960s. This is a letter General George Washington wrote to Congress to give them advice about what to do now that we had won the Revolutionary War. Look at the date very carefully. This is just after we signed the treaty with England that settled our Revolutionary War and recognized the United States as its own country. England wasn't allegedly going to invade us again and was going to leave us alone. So the Congress asks General Washington for his advice, and he writes about a 4 or 5 page letter. You can find this letter, it's no doubt online today. The Savage's Wolf letter is what people call it. I'm only going to show you a few paragraphs that's on the final page. He starts to advise Congress how to deal with the Indian nations. Now, I've cut this down quite a bit, but this is an accurate quote. I won't read it. You can read it faster than I can. He said, let's buy lands from the Indians. It's cheaper than fighting them. Next point, as we advance well, look at this. He says, we cannot talk about settling the western country of this continent if we can't make peace with the Indians. He says it is so analogous that we must do it. And we must be on good terms with the Indian nations and purchase their lands in preference to driving them away. Now look what he starts to do, an analogy of Indian peoples to animals. This is why this is called the Savage's Wolf letter. And look at the next phrase. So he says, let's sign treaties. Let's buy land and assets from tribes. Let's not fight wars. And I'll let you read this ugly part. Now you can see why it's called the Savage's Wolf letter. He continues that analogy of Indians to animals. Some of the stuff I had to cut out to make it fit on one slide was he mentioned something like, as we advance our borders, the animals retreat. And he says it's the same with the savage as the wolf. But look at that sentence I underlined and bolded. I don't think I'm misinterpreting what George was writing about. I'm not libeling George Washington. He compared Indians to animals. He said they are both beasts of prey, though they differ in shape. That's about as ugly a language as, okay, so I'm not going to belabor this, but this was American policy till about the 1960s. That Indian peoples, social Darwinism it's called, folks, that Indian cultures, indigenous cultures were so weak and not as good as Christian cultures and Christian nations that they were just going to disappear. That's what social Darwinism in a nutshell. And this was American policy. Indian peoples were going to disappear. Alcoholism, diseases, they got to get out of the way because Americans are here now. Okay, jump ahead another decade or so. What did our founding fathers of the United States and our Constitution, what did they think of Indian nations and Indian peoples? And so I'm going to spend some time showing you the 4 provisions of the Constitution that are applicable to my talk today. Tribes are mentioned only once in the Constitution, but it's in this clause, which is a very important clause of the Constitution, folks, and you know it as the Interstate Commerce Clause. But those of us who practice Indian law and the United States Supreme Court call this the Indian Commerce Clause also, and you'll see why. Why does Congress have the authority over interstate highways? Why does the Congress have the authority over airlines and airports and trains and trucking, et cetera? Because it's commerce that's done interstate. Here's the clause. Congress has the power to regulate commerce with the foreign nations and among the several states. So that's why it's called the Interstate Commerce Clause. But look at the last entity referenced here, Indian tribes. This is now remember, it's the only express reference to tribes in the Constitution. I will show you an implied reference to tribes in just a minute. But let's analyze this for a moment. When you go to law school, so when you all come down to Arizona State and become my students, we'll be teaching you this in your first year, how to interpret statutes or here provisions in a constitution. And under a Latin phrase called jusdem generis, when there's a list of items in a statute or in a constitutional provision, they are deemed to be somewhat similar. That's why they're in the list. Some sort of power or right is being delineated. And so the fact that tribes are mentioned here with the foreign nations and with the 13 states of the United States, tribes are governments. Our founding fathers knew they were governments, dealt with them as governments, negotiated diplomatically and politically, and signed treaties with tribes. But that rule, a jusdem generis, also tells us these items in the list are somewhat different, and that's why they are listed separately. And let me give you one of the best examples of a jusdem generis. Chief Justice John Marshall, certainly our most famous Chief Justice, in 1831 was faced with a case whether the Cherokee Nation was a foreign nation. So this is one of the most famous Supreme Court cases on Indian law. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote 3 opinions. We're going to talk about 2 of them today, and they're called the Marshall Trilogy. When you teach Indian law, when you take Indian law, you will read the Marshall Trilogy. And in this case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Cherokee Nation claimed it was a foreign nation, and the Supreme Court had to decide, was that true? And so you can read that opinion, and Marshall looks at this statute, looks at this provision of our Constitution, looks at a jusdem generis and says, if Indian nations were foreign nations, they wouldn't be listed there separately. So he might be correct in statutory interpretation and jusdem generis that is right. He says if Indian nations, if our founding fathers thought Indian tribes were foreign nations, they wouldn't have added those last 5 words, because the tribes would have been encompassed in the words foreign nations. So in that famous Cherokee Nation versus Georgia case, the court holds the Cherokee Nation is not a foreign nation. And in fact, they use a classic phrase we still use today. Tribes are, and this is a quote, domestic dependent nations. They're inside the United States, domestic, and they are dependent on the United States. And that's exactly what Cherokee Nation versus Georgia is still cited for to this day. Okay, our founding fathers, those 55 old rich white guys that met in Philadelphia from May to October 1787, drafting our Constitution, this is what they thought of Indian nations. James Madison, often called the father of our Constitution, drafted this provision. I've looked at the notes from the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. There is almost no debate and almost no edits to the language he used for this clause. So all 55 of those founding fathers, they knew what tribes were. Tribes are governments. Tribes deserve to be in this list. The United States and the colonies and England and France and Holland had signed treaties with, and Spain had signed treaties with Indian nations that are now inside what the United States. So this is clear. The United States cites this provision 30, 40, 50 times in their cases on Indian law. There's no question that tribes are governments, sovereign powers, separate from the United States, but falling within this interesting definition of domestic dependent nations. So we just had our census, folks. Indian peoples are mentioned twice in the Constitution. And both times, it supports the argument that Indian peoples are citizens of their own government. And at that time, were not deemed to be United States citizens and were not deemed to be state citizens. So this is literally the definition of who should be counted in the census, folks, which we just had our census finished, right? You can read that. I don't need to read it to you. You're supposed to count everyone according to their respective number. But look, were Indians to be counted at all? No, not unless they paid taxes. So they were not considered to be part of the American body politic, the federal or the state or the county or the city body politic, unless they were voluntarily paying taxes. Now, I have to make reference to this. You're probably all familiar with this 3/5 of all other persons. That's a reference to the slaves primarily of the South, although there were plenty of slaves in the North in 1787. Don't forget that. And so the slaves were only counted as 3/5 of a person in determining the size of your state population, which, remember, what's the reason for that? To know how many congressmen and women you get. Back then, you got one congressman, and they were all men, of course, for every 60,000 people. Now we get one congressman or congresswoman for 600,000 people. That's why some states only have one congressman or woman, and Oregon has 5, and California has 53. But anyway, I just want to point out to you folks, it's not the South that demanded that 3/5 person. This is not some kind of anti-slavery or anti-Black person provision. It's the Northerners that demanded this because they didn't want to have the South to count people they didn't even call people. They didn't want to count them in the population because that would have given the Southern states more congressmen. And so this is really not some kind of racist, anti-Black provision in the Constitution. This was a struggle about how to control the power of the South and so ultimately the population. Okay, as you know, this provision got changed at the end of the Civil War and the 14th Amendment. And Black people were counted as a full-fledged citizen of the United States. I guess here, let me go ahead to this just since I mentioned the 14th Amendment. So at the end of the Civil War, we get the 3 Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, that protected the civil rights, the voting rights, et cetera, and made full-fledged citizens of African Americans. So look at that. They took out the language about the 3/5 of a person. But what were Indians considered in 1868, folks? Not citizens, not federal citizens, not state citizens, unless they voluntarily paid taxes. I want to point you to one Supreme Court case that's quite interesting. In 1884, Mr. Elk wanted to be a citizen of a state. He wanted to vote. I believe he was in Kansas. He had moved into the town. He was involved he had left his tribe. I don't want to be an Indian. I want to be a state citizen, an American. I want to vote. The US Supreme Court read this language in the 14th Amendment, and they said, well, he's plainly a human being, and he was plainly born inside the United States. But is he a citizen under the 14th Amendment? And they said no. So Indian peoples were not state or federal citizens in 1884. And in fact, they did not become citizens until 1924 when the federal government passed a law. Now, I call this my mom's provision. This is the Hazel Miller provision in federal law. My mom's maiden name was Captain. She's where my Indian ancestry comes from. She was born in Oklahoma, near where our tribe is. And when she was born, she was not a citizen of the United States because she was an Indian. Under Elk v. Wilkins, under the 14th Amendment and the First Amendment, et cetera, or the first Article 1. But by the time she's about 1 year old, she was made a citizen of the United States. So let me just take you back to the Treaty Clause provision. So we've looked at the Interstate Commerce Clause. We looked at the Census Bureau discussion of who we count. And now what are treaties? And so tribes aren't mentioned here expressly, but this provision absolutely encompasses Indian treaties and Indian governments. You can read that faster than me. This is also called the Supremacy Clause. I know you've all heard of that phrase. Federal law is supreme. Our federal government is supposed to be a limited government, only has the powers expressly stated in the Constitution. The state governments exercise general authority of governance, but the federal government has limited powers. But when it is exercising its power pursuant to the Constitution, state law has to give way because of the Supremacy Clause. So the Article 6 of our Constitution is both called the Treaty Clause and the Supremacy Clause. So why do I say tribes are mentioned here? You don't see the word Indian, you don't see Indian nations, you don't see indigenous people. Well, I'll tell you why, because I've done the research. Read this very carefully, folks. We're doing a little more statutory construction. This Constitution and the laws of the United States and all treaties made. Now, folks, read this carefully. That's a past tense reference. What in corporate law we would call a ratification of something you've already done. All treaties made, comma, and now the provision becomes prospective, looking to future treaties, or which shall be made, are the supreme law of the land. So why do I say Indian nations are included by implication? Because I've done the research here, folks. By the time this provision became effective in March of 1789, and George Washington and John Adams were sworn in as the new president and vice president, our first under this Constitution, the United States had signed 9 treaties with Indian tribes, including my own. Remember, there were previous iterations of American government, national American government, before our current United States under our current Constitution. And so that phrase, all treaties made, is a past tense reference to the 9 treaties the United States had signed with tribes. And I've also counted how many treaties we'd signed with other countries by March of 1789. And the United States had signed 23 treaties with Russia, France, England, Holland, Morocco, etc. And so this is a past tense reference to Indian nation treaties. So, I've written on this, I've talked on this. These are the 4 provisions that encompass Indian nations and Indian peoples in the Constitution. What do we learn from it? We learned that Indians were not United States citizens. They were not citizens of Virginia or New York, even though they lived inside the borders of Virginia and New York. They were citizens of their own government, a separate government that the United States dealt with through treaty making. So I want you, if you take one thing away from today, so I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe. I'm literally a citizen of 3 governments. I'm a United States citizen, the same as all of you. I'm a citizen now of Arizona. I used to be of Oregon, as probably most of you are. But I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe too. In the eyes of my tribe, my government, and in the eyes of the United States, I am an Indian. And with that, excuse me, comes certain rights, but also certain other obligations and responsibilities of citizenship. I'll give you just one example. The Supreme Court has held that Indian tribes cannot criminally prosecute a non-Indian. So all of you in the audience today, if you are a non-Indian, you go over to Warm Springs Reservation in Central Oregon, or you go on the Grand Ronde Reservation an hour from Portland, you cannot be criminally prosecuted by those tribal governments. I can be, because I am an Indian recognized under my own tribe's laws and then recognized as such by the United States. So the 574 federally recognized tribes there are in the United States can criminally prosecute me. They cannot criminally prosecute you if you are not an Indian. So that's it. Just one interesting example of what citizenship. I can vote in my tribe's elections. You cannot. Certain things like that. I have rights in my tribe's assets. You do not. So citizenship. Okay, let's move ahead. I actually forget what the next slide is. See, this is why I like PowerPoint. I'm as surprised as you guys are. What's next? Oh, okay. What is the status of Indian treaties? What were Indian treaties? So from our very first form of government, the Continental Congress signed their first treaty with the Delaware tribe because we wanted to cross Delaware lands to attack Fort Detroit in what's now Michigan and during the Revolutionary War. And we signed a treaty with the Delaware saying, will you give us permission for the American Army to cross your territory? And in fact, that treaty offered the Delaware the right to confederate with other tribes and maybe become a state someday. That provision's never been repeated in any other treaty that the United States signed with tribes. But let me repeat that. The United States in 1778 offered the Delaware to confederate with other tribes and perhaps become one of the states of the Union. Well, gosh, there is a state called Delaware, isn't it? It's just not, it's not just the Delaware Indians. Anyway, Congress stopped treaty making in 1871. So this number 375 is not going to change unless Congress was to undo that 1871 law. But what are treaties? Now, those of you who live in the Pacific Northwest, you know all about treaty salmon rights. The Warm Springs Tribe, the Yakima, the Nez Perce in Idaho, and the Umatilla Tribe, in northeastern Oregon. They signed treaties in 1855 that guaranteed their right to catch fish. If you've been around as long as I have, there have been lawsuits galore about the Indian rights to fish for commercial purposes, even while these fish are listed on the Endangered Species Act. One of my articles is about that. What treaty rights still existed to fish for salmon once they started to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. But look what the Supreme Court said in 1979. And this was a case out of the state of Washington about some of the tribes' treaty rights to fish. And the Supreme Court said that treaties are just like contracts between nations. And the Supreme Court interprets treaties like contracts. They're a trade of property rights. They're a recognition of commercial rights, political rights, human rights. And that's the way the Supreme Court has read them. The Supreme Court has heard 7 cases, folks, since 1905 about the treaty rights in the Pacific Northwest with the Oregon tribes and the Washington tribes, and most of them have been about salmon fishing disputes. This 1979 case I'm showing you here is the 7th Supreme Court case about the treaties in the Pacific Northwest. Here's the very first one. It was about Yakima people going to the Columbia River to fish at what are called the UNAs. The treaty uses the phrase usual and accustomed sites. The Indians reserve for themselves the right to fish at their usual and accustomed sites. So Indian people in Oregon and Washington know the phrase UNAs. Oh yeah, there's a UNA there. There's where we've always fished. There's where we still get to fish because of the treaty rights. And this is the very first one of the United States Supreme Court cases. So there's several things to be learned about it, but I want to tell you what are treaties. They are reserved rights. The United States did not give tribes anything. The United States was driving a hard bargain, trying to get the lands and the assets from Indian peoples and Indian nations. And so the way the Supreme Court defines a treaty is that the tribe sold some things to the U.S., sold some land to the U.S., agreed maybe to live on a small reservation. But in fact, that's why we call them reservations, folks, is because the tribe reserved those lands from its much bigger whole. It said, okay, United States, we'll sign a treaty with you. We'll sell you 90% of our land maybe, but this part here is ours to keep forever. And that's why we call it a reservation. In Canada and I started to say in Australia, they call them reserves. So the same idea. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about, I think these are the 7 eras. We're talking about history, and I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I still got 17 minutes, so I don't have to talk so fast. But I got so much to say, and I got books to sell you, so we got to get to that at the end, right? Oh, sorry about that. So what policies did the United States pursue throughout our history against or for Indigenous peoples and the nations? And these policy areas are not things I've made up, folks. Every historian, every American historian that works on Indian issues agrees on these 7 main eras of federal Indian policy. Now, I added the George Washington Savage's Wolf one, the letter we just looked at. But here's the one that historians talk about. Our very first Congress, folks, July 22, 1790, the very first Congress under our new Constitution passed what's called the Trade and Non-Intercourse Act to control commercial relations between Americans and the tribes. And so that act, which is still in effect today, folks, it's been amended a little bit since then, but that original act from 1790 is still the law today. And so the United States wanted to control who traded with tribes. The United States did not want alcohol provided to tribes. Tribal leaders did not want alcohol in their homelands. They demanded in treaty negotiation sessions that alcohol be kept out. Do you know that most Indian reservations in the United States are still dry today? Prohibition, which did not work for the United States and has not worked for Indian people, is still the federal law. Tribes can allow alcohol now if they adopt state law and pass an ordinance that gets approved by the Secretary of Interior. So if you go out to gamble at the Warm Spring Grand Ronde Reservation, you can have a night wine with a nice dinner in the restaurant. But most reservations are still dry, I think 75%. So there are other provisions of the act. I don't have time to cover that. People have written books on the subject. What was the next policy of the United States? Well, it was to remove all the tribes that were east of the Mississippi River to the west. My own tribe was removed. You've all heard of the Trail of Tears. Most people only think of the tribes from the southeast part of the United States. So we think of what are called the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminoles. Those are the 5 primary tribes that are called the 5 civilized tribes from Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and they were forcibly removed to what's now eastern Oklahoma. Well, my tribe was in south central Ohio when we signed our removal treaty in 1831, and we were forcibly removed to northeast Oklahoma in September to December 1832. So that's how my mom came to be born in northeastern Oklahoma. Now, you see those dates, and historians do put these relatively strict dates on these eras, but they often overlap. They often were predestined by thinking before these dates. In fact, you know what George Washington's letter said. Didn't he say all the tribes were going to disappear? An American frontier would advance and the tribes, like the animals, would just disappear. So the idea of removal was really nothing new. And Thomas Jefferson, when he was president in 1803, he wrote 3 private letters in 1803. And he was writing one to a general and 2 other letters he wrote to Indian agents. And he sort of like behind his hand, he goes, well, this is not, he said this in one letter, this is not for public knowledge, but we know all the tribes east of the Mississippi are going to have to move west. Well, why is that? I wish Jefferson was alive and I could ask him why he wrote that. You, the United States, signed treaties with these tribes guaranteeing them their lands forever. Why are you now saying they've got to move? Well, it's because Euro-Americans, Christians, non-Indians wanted their lands and their assets. That is purely what, and that's why I focus on that Savage's Wolf letter. That was the policy. Get Indian peoples out of the way so Americans can have all the lands and all the assets. Okay, 1849 is given as the idea, as the date, because it's in 1849 that the gold rush to California overwhelmed the United States. Texas and California started creating reservations. And instead of trying to move all Indians to eastern Oklahoma, remember there was no Oklahoma then, it was called the Indian Territory. And the tribes that moved there, the treaties they moved there under said they would never be under the law of a state or a federal territory again. So that was a complete lie because, of course, that's all Oklahoma now. But it was not a state in the 1830s when the tribes agreed to move there. And some tribes were forced there by bayonet. But now the idea of moving every tribe to Oklahoma is impossible. The country's growing so fast because of the gold rush. And the Oregon Trail opened, what, 1841? You now put tribes on little bitty reservations out of the way of Americans and out of the areas Americans wanted. Folks, you are not going to be surprised to hear that in Oregon, all the tribes were, what the federal government wanted and what Oregonians wanted was to move the tribes to Eastern Oregon because the land was worthless there, they thought. And what Oregon Americans wanted was the fertile farmland in the Willamette Valley. So the Grand Ronde resisted, although they're barely in the Willamette Valley, are they? But the Siletz, if you know the history of Siletz, they were forced to the Oregon coast, to land that was inaccessible and worthless at the time. And the other tribes were forcibly removed to various places. So Oregon, these policies and goals of the United States are all reflected in an Oregon history too. So put Indians on reservations. At first, a lot of the treaties, the reservation was enormous. What the best example I can give you is the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. The Arapaho and Shoshone people, their reservation was 44 million acres under their first treaty. 5 years later, the United States signs another treaty with them and their reservations reduced to 5 million acres. I don't know exactly how large the Wind River Reservation is today, but I bet it's barely 1 million acres. So now we stopped signing treaties with tribes and recognizing large reservations. Now the allotment and assimilation era, the goal was to break the reservations up. President Theodore Roosevelt in 1906 called the Allotment Act. The Allotment Act was enacted in 1887. And I can quote you what he said. He says, the Allotment Act is a great pulverizing engine designed to destroy tribal governments. So that was the American policy. That was what the savage is wolf. That's what George Washington foresaw. That's what social Darwinism predicted, etc. So a lot of reservations today are broken up into little bitty pieces. So the borders might be like this. There might be a 400,000 acre reservation defined in a treaty with the borders like this. But on the reservation, lots of non-Indians live there now on land they own, absolute, and what's called fee simple absolute, because the reservation was cut up into little checkerboard pieces of land. That's where the word allotment comes from. And these allotments were granted to Native peoples, and many of them lost them through sales over the years, through tax foreclosures because they didn't pay state taxes on this little allotment they were given, and fraud. In Oklahoma, the fraud was unbelievable, folks. My reservation was allotted in 1888. My grandfather, by the time he got a piece in about 1903, I think he was 5 years old. I still to this day have no knowledge of how he lost his land. I'm trying to do a project and research this. Okay. What time is it? See, I can spin off into other subjects. I got to watch it. So Congress changed its mind, 180-degree switch in 1934 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt gets elected and the Democrats take over the Congress. Allotment is ended, frozen in place. No more allotments of reservations, no sales of allotments. Indian lands cannot be lost. And so we get what's called the Indian Reorganization Act. And now instead of trying to destroy Indian peoples and to destroy Indian governments, it becomes the policy of the United States to support tribal governments. In fact, tribes are encouraged to write constitutions and draft them and to create corporations and to try to make money, to try to address the poverty issues and the poor educational levels in Indian countries. Folks, in case I forget this, American Indians, even today with some very successful casinos and a few very rich tribes, American Indians are the poorest people in the United States on average, the least educated people in the United States on average, and the sickest people with shortest lifespan, highest infant death mortality rates on average in the United States. So don't think that, a tribe like Grand Ronde that's making a lot of money and gives out grants to other people like the Portland Art Museum and the local sheriff's department and the local hospitals. That's not the situation of the the majority of 574 tribes in the US. Anyway, I digress there, but I just want you to be aware of some of these facts and what George Washington's policy led to. Is it any surprise that Indian people are the sickest, the poorest, and the least educated? This is in Hawaii, Native Hawaiians are in this situation. In Alaska, Native Alaskans are in this situation. Everywhere the British Isles, the British Empire went, the indigenous peoples are in this situation. The Maoris in New Zealand, the Aboriginal peoples in Australia are the poorest, the sickest, shortest lifespan, least educated in all of those societies. It's not a surprise when the policy of the government is to kill you and to take all your property and rights. My reference to citation, George Washington Savage's Wolf Letter. Okay, I'm making you all happy and uplifting you on this Sunday morning, aren't I? But you know, you asked me to talk about this history, and it's not a very good one. Okay, it got even worse in Congress. Now, folks, let me make one more comment about the Indian Reorganization Act. About 2/3 of the tribes, federally recognized tribes in the United States today, those 574 tribes, they did organize themselves under the Indian Reorganization Act. They did take advantage of what Congress offered to try to improve their lives and to improve their governments. I've written on this subject. I can only find about 160 to 200 tribal constitutions, but a tribe that organized under the Indian Reorganization Act will have a written constitution. My own tribe does, from 1936. And I've literally been working on a committee. We're looking at editing and maybe amending our constitution. Anyway, so the termination era. And for those of you in Oregon, this act had a horrific impact in Oregon. Congress did another 180-degree change and now says, let's get rid of all tribes. And what did they mean by that, folks? You're not killing every Indian person, but what they meant is we don't want to have a federal relationship with Indian nations anymore. That's what Congress wanted to terminate. Now, they put good political spin language on it. They said, oh, we want to make Indians equal citizens. We want Indians to have all the rights of Americans. They shouldn't have to be under their tribal government, the tyranny of their tribal government. Well, no tribe, no Indian asked for the termination era, folks. Congress imposed it. And in Oregon, let's see, let me back up. Under the termination era, 109 Indian tribes were terminated from having a political relationship with the United States. 61 of those tribes were in Oregon. The Siletz tribe, the Grand Ronde Tribe, if you don't know, it's a confederated tribe of the remnants of 26 different tribes. They were all terminated, I think, in 1953 under an act called an Act for the Tribes in Western Oregon. But so this was a disastrous era. Indian peoples and Indian nations were in the worst shape ever in the 1950s. But Congress changed this policy, and we live in this policy era now. Self-determination. The Kennedy administration came into power. So again, it's a Democratic administration, Democratic Congress, and they ended the termination era. The Kennedy administration continued terminating a few tribes that were already in the process. So the Klamath tribe, if you know, in Southern Oregon, it was terminated, I think, in '61. And that termination was completed by the Kennedy administration. But the Kennedy administration said, we will not terminate a tribe unless they ask it. And guess what? No Indian tribe has ever asked to have its political status, its political power, its treaty rights to be terminated. So we still live in this era now. Everyone thinks it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. President Nixon literally gave it the name in a speech he gave in 1970. Lyndon Johnson was very helpful because remember, he did his Great Society program, his anti-poverty programs, provided some jobs, some training programs that Indian country took advantage of. But it's Nixon that gave this era its name. And then he proposed and drafted one of the most important acts today in Indian law, which is called the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. It was not enacted till 75, which he had resigned by then. And so Gerald Ford signs it into law. But it was a Nixon administration idea and policy. Tribes are encouraged to run their own business. The federal government still assists, helps, still ostensibly honors the treaty rights and the rights, human rights, et cetera, of Indian peoples. But tribal communities are encouraged to be in charge of their own policies, their own laws, their own programs. The feds still support. The feds are not supposed to reduce federal funding to various Indian programs, but we are in this era now. I think I'm right at the suggested time, but let me just close with this point then, David. So again, I'm going to give you 3 bullet points, and this comes from the most famous historian of federal Indian history and law. I'm sure he's deceased now. He was a Catholic priest. He was a professor at Marquette, Francis Paul Pruka. And I think it's he who came up with this idea that there are 3 main themes that have been behind American history and law of Indian law. So let me end with this. That constitutional provision we started out today with, folks, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, Article 1, Section 3, or maybe I'm confused. Go back to slide 1. Congress has the power to do almost anything it wants, good or bad, to Indian nations and Indian peoples. And throughout our history, Congress has done good things and a lot of bad things to Indian peoples. Now, this reminds me of something I didn't finish my thought earlier. And so I want to say this now while it went through my brain again. One thing I want you to remember when you leave this talk: Indian peoples are not an ethnic group. They're not a racial entity like Latinos, like African Americans or Asian Americans. And this is an oxymoron, because how do most tribes, or it's a conundrum here, how do most tribes determine who their citizens are? Well, they do it based on descent and ancestry, and perhaps an amount of blood quantum, BQ it's called. So that looks like a racial group. It looks like a separate ethnic entity. But because of the political status of tribes, folks, because of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 in our Constitution, tribes are governments and their citizens are political, diplomatic entities. So when I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe, yes, of course, it's based on my descent from my mom and a certain amount of blood quantum. But once my tribe makes that decision, that's a political decision made by a government recognized by the United States and the Constitution as a government. And so that's when I mentioned earlier that I'm a citizen of 3 governments, and most of you are only of 2, a state and the feds. So I hope you will remember that when Indian people advocate, these are political rights, these are diplomatic rights, these are treaty rights. This is a relationship with Congress that's based on law, and it's not affirmative action. Maybe that's how the best way I should word this. Tribal rights are not affirmative action. They are political rights, historical rights based on treaties, etc. So back to my 3 main themes. Congress can do anything it wants. The Supreme Court has never struck down an act of Congress for being beyond its power in Indian affairs. Never, even when it's done bad things. Second, tribes are governments, but some of their sovereignty has been diminished since the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1800s. And you can read that as fast as I can. Tribes retain all of their sovereignty unless Congress took it away. So this is that old joke, refer back to rule number 1. You know that old joke, the boss is always right. What do you do if the boss is wrong? Refer back to rule number 1. So here's refer back to rule number 1. Or if the tribe gave up some of its authority in a treaty, of course, that's how it is today. So when tribes gave up and sold 90% of their land to the United States and kept a reservation, they might have no rights out here anymore in that 90%. So it's a power, it's a sovereignty, a governance that they gave up. And then the third big clause is the trust relationship that the United States owes to tribes because of treaties, because of this attempted extermination, genocide, let's call it that, folks, or ethnic cleansing. What the United States did to Indian peoples falls into both those categories. I don't think there's any question. So I'm what, 5 minutes over where I was supposed to stop. Here's my Lewis and Clark stuff. You're just, oh, there's my map. Wow, international law defined the growth of the United States. Every aspect of growth of the United States is based on this international law I referred to earlier, the papal bulls, the line of demarcation. And in this case here, Chief Justice John Marshall's first Indian law case is about what we call today the doctrine of discovery. Here's my 10 elements. You're just going to have to buy my book, Manifest Destiny. Helen, you said you were really interested in that. I'll take 30 seconds. This is what historians say manifest destiny is. We all learned the phrase in school, but grade school probably, but what did it really mean? Well, this is what historians, this is not my take on it, from an Indian law perspective. This is what American historians say. Americans are special. Our government is special. We're going to take it to the whole world. It's our mission, and we're doing it under God's direction. This is what historians say. And so, oh boy, there we're to my favorite book. So here's my commercial, folks. Buy my book. This is the paperback edition. That was a 13-week law school class delivered in 45 minutes.
You did a great job. You did a great job. I do have a few folks that have some questions. So I'm going to start with David Beam. David B., you want to come in and ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you. Yes, Professor, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. I wish all non-Indians in the United States could hear that presentation. I think that'd be fabulous. About 25 years ago, I worked for a tribe, and I worked for them for about 3 years. And all the things that the horrific things that have happened to tribal people, the tribes, they're all true. And certainly the amount of resources that they have to work with on their reservations and whatnot are meager, certainly. But in my experience of that 3 years, and I was interested to hear you did a book on economic development with the tribes, because the work I did was economic development and planning. And from my experience, it was pretty frustrating in the sense of there was just overwhelming amount of what I would call the victim mentality or learned helplessness, however you want to gauge that. So, and for lots of good reasons that you all pointed out, but that was quite frustrating. So if you were, the tribal chief or whatever you had a magic wand, what would be some of your suggestions? I mean, I don't know if that's what you find to be an overall experience with a lot of tribal people, but if that's true, then what would you say would be the best approaches to try to counter that sort of mentality?
That's an excellent question. And if you want to tell us, I'm interested in what tribe you worked with. But anyway, I'm teaching a class right now, and it's my second book that I wrote on economic development is when Arizona State started to recruit me. And I never thought I would leave Oregon. Lifelong Oregonian, who wants to live down here in the desert, right? Mm-hmm. But this is the #1 Indian program in the country with Indian students that, at Lewis and Clark, I would have 2 or 3 native students in the student body. And down here we have like 35 and so many grads, it's unbelievable. So I just had to come here. But economic development is one of the things, David. Without money, how do you run a government? How do you have a healthcare system? How do you have cops? How do you have courts? How do you have health facilities and social services? And how do you feed people? And yet, how do you come from a very poor, deprived background? So what you're mentioning is probably replicated in the inner city experience. Tribes need everything. They need to improve their human capital. Native people, yes, the idea of complaining about the United States in my classes and in my book anymore, I kind of say that I'm even tired about talking about how poor Indian country is. Okay, that's where we're at. Let's move forward.
Mm-hmm.
So David, the experience you're talking about and what tribe it is, yes, every tribe's in trauma. I can't remember quite the right word for this, but generational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Your elders were killed. My mom was sent to boarding school to be taught to be a little homemaker, to work as a maid for white people, or excuse me, non-Indians. It's hard to overcome something like that, David. So it takes generations, but improving your human capital. A lot of tribes now have tribal colleges. There are 37 tribal colleges, folks. The only one in the Pacific Northwest I know of is up at Lummi, almost to Canada. It's called the Northwest Indian College. It does give a 4-year bachelor's degree. Most of these tribal colleges only give associates 2-year degrees. But let me give you a stat that ties in a little to what you asked, David. Indian people that go from the reservation, maybe forget even the reservation, Indian students that go to 4-year colleges, they succeed better if they got their associate's degree first at a tribal college. Statistics prove they will get their bachelor's degree more often if they started at a tribal college. I don't even know the answer to that, David, but it's something about going to a school with your community, your people, maybe your language is taught there, your culture's taught there, and then you get a little older and then you transition to a 4-year school. I don't know, but that's what studies show. So what you said, yes, we've got to get rid of victim mentality, and we got to use this self-determination era to do this stuff for ourselves. I told my class this last Thursday. How much does the federal government really care? How much does an employee of the Bureau of Indian Affairs really care? Who cares the most about, raising all boats in one community and improving everyone? So it's the job of tribal leadership. I'm tired of talking about what the feds did or didn't do, and I'm tired of blaming the feds. So if I hear the tone behind your question, I agree with you. We're the ones who care the most. We're the ones that have to do it.
Okay. No.
Professor Miller, I have a question from Hank Robb, which was elk in Elk versus Wilkes paying taxes. Is there a legal distinction between a nation and a tribe? Those are 2 questions he had.
I don't remember the elk case that well, so you could look it up and report back to me.
All right.
Anyway, I do think he was living in the town. He had physically separated himself from the reservation and his people, and he wanted to be part of that community. I would guess he was paying taxes, but I don't know the answer. Now you're saying, yes, tribe or nation. No, to me, they're the same thing. In treaties, the United States often use the word band or tribe or nation. Now, politically today, a lot of tribes have changed their name. They do think the word nation carries a stronger message. So you asked an excellent question. I use them interchangeably. I'm probably more used to saying tribe because that's the official name of my tribe. And my tribe even has the word Oklahoma in it. And some people would criticize that. We are called the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. And there are plenty of people that say you should drop that Oklahoma thing. What does that mean, of Oklahoma? So yes, you asked an excellent question that I don't know what you would call that, sort of a political messaging. That's probably what you were thinking.
I have a comment from Ingrid. the Supreme Court in July 2020 ruled that much of eastern Oklahoma falls within an Indian reservation, a decision that could reshape the criminal justice system by preventing state authorities from prosecuting offenses that were involved Native Americans. In a 5-4 decision, potentially one of the most consequential legal victories for Native Americans in decades, could have far-reaching implications for the people who live across what the court affirmed was Indian country. The land included much of Tulsa, Oklahoma's second biggest city. Do you have any comments on that?
The reason I laughed, if you saw me laugh the moment you started, this is the
Yes.
McGirt case v. Oklahoma. It came out July the 9th. My wife, I woke up that morning, she goes, "You guys won that case." I couldn't believe it. Your question just says this is so controversial. I think this is probably the most important Supreme Court case in over 100 years. So whoever asked that question and any of the others that are interested, go to that SSRN webpage I gave you. I'm currently writing an article and I already have draft articles on my SSRN page. You can get a 6,000 word article that's going to come out in the Federal Lawyer magazine in April. And I have a 20-page single-spaced paper that I literally was working on today. I have a co-author, and I'm going to sign a contract to write a book on McGirt.
Okay.
What you said is exactly right. This is an earth-shattering decision. 5-4. Now, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has already passed, and no one knows what Amy Coney Barrett thinks about Indian law. She probably knows nothing about Indian law. And she's going to now be, so we don't know what will happen. But whoever asked that question, let me bring you even more up to date. Well, that case, and let me tell everyone else so that you know, the McGirt decision decided by a 5-4 vote that the Muskogee Creek Reservation still exists. Contra to what everyone in Oklahoma thought, the reservation was not gone. The Muskogee Creek Nation had about 135 acres of land as allotments. Now, remember back to that Allotment Act I mentioned to you from 1887, and I mentioned my own tribe was allotted in 1888. But allotment acts don't change the borders of a reservation unless Congress says so expressly. And so all the McGirt decision said was Congress never changed the borders of the Muskogee Creek Reservation. Now I want to drop the bombshell on you. While the Muskogee Creek on July the 8th had about 135,000 acres in trust that's called Indian country, the next day they woke up and found out under the McGirt decision that they had 3.25 million acre reservation, and it is all Indian country. And again, whoever asked the question is correct. That's part of Tulsa. 400,000 people in Tulsa woke up July the 9th and found out they live on the Muskogee Creek Reservation. So I encourage you, if you're at all interested in this, go to my SSRN webpage, download for free. I've written 3 articles on it. One's 800 words long. That's posted there. One is the 6,000 word one that's going to come out in a magazine in April. And the other one I will be submitting to law review articles the first week of February. And so it's going to be 30,000 words.
Okay.
Anyway, you can see what that means. So let me take that answer one step further. I think I started to allude to this already. Other state courts in Oklahoma have already held that the Seminole Reservation still exists. The Cherokee Nation still exists. So these are millions and millions of acres. My own tribe is involved in a lawsuit for another tribe in northeastern Oklahoma. And this Oklahoma State Court is asking, is the Ottawa Reservation still in existence? And your question that now there's no state criminal jurisdiction on that reservation, there is state criminal jurisdiction for crimes committed by non-Indians, but the state loses criminal jurisdiction over crimes allegedly committed by an Indian. So Oklahoma, there was panic in Oklahoma, folks, July the 10th, people were worried about, did I lose my title to my house? There were articles in the newspapers. Okay, I'm getting excited. I may have to stand up. But my wife and I say it's all McGirt all the time. This case, since July the 9th, I literally was on the Voice of America radio program that day talking about it. I have given multiple Zoom lectures. You can go on YouTube. The American Philosophical Society had me do something November 19. You can see that talk on Zoom. The Oregon Historical Society, and this is on YouTube. You can see me give a talk for the Oregon Historical Society on, it was 1 week later. So I think it was July 16. That's online. And so you can see these talks if you want to hear me expound on McGirt. But I call this the Indian law bombshell. Some people are telling me I'm overhyping this, but what your question shows, you recognize the impact to Oklahoma, to the Indian nations there, and to just Joe Blow common citizen. And that's what I'm writing right now. When we get off this call, I'm getting back to work. So anyway, thank you for that question.
I think we're going to have time for one more quick question. Can you make it?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate your lecture. It was wonderful. Thank you very much. You didn't mention very much about anything that the Native peoples have contributed to the United States. I understand that John Adams, for example, the Atlas of Independence, was raised in a household that did quite a bit of business with the Native peoples, and that he kind of admired the way some of their attitudes towards government worked, and that a lot of this kind of carried over into our Constitution, even though Adams at the time when he was raised was a subject of the English king. He saw that the Native people didn't consider themselves subjects of the English king, even though they were living on land the English king claimed. And they didn't even really consider themselves subjects of a tribe, that the people had some kind of independence of themselves. The concept of rights reserved by the people in the Bill of Rights could have been something that was that we actually picked up from the Native people. That there was a lot of intercourse between the two cultures along this stretch of the Eastern Seaboard, and that we really gained a lot from the Native people. And you didn't mention any of that or any other later contributions perhaps that Native people made to the overall United States. I'm just looking for things to bring us together.
Sure. You need to go on my SSRN webpage and download an article I wrote when I was a third-year law student at Lewis and Clark, and I published it. The American Indian Influence on the United States Constitution and its founders. So what you just referenced, I analyze a little bit how much people like Benjamin Franklin knew about Indian country, how much Benjamin Franklin and other founding fathers negotiated treaties with Indian tribes. They understood how the Haudenosaunee, if people have heard the word the Iroquois Confederacy, they call themselves the Haudenosaunee. They are the 6 nations of upstate New York. They have governed themselves as a confederacy since probably 1100 AD. Other historians will say they didn't start till the 1500s, but they have annual conferences. They decide congresses. They're led by 50 leaders, chiefs, who are given a symbol of office. They wear an antler horn head, and women have the power to take that position away from them. So we call that recall. That's in our Constitution. So I argue in this article that we learned about that from the Haudenosaunee and Native peoples. And before I forget, let me tell you what Benjamin Franklin wrote. In 1744, an Indian chief of the Iroquois Confederacy, Canestego, he gave a speech to Benjamin Franklin and some other of our founding fathers, literally, and Pennsylvania officials. He said, you folks, you colonies need a union like we Iroquois have. And within a decade, now do you know this? Franklin's famous in 1754 for his Albany Plan, in which he encouraged a union of the 13 colonies. And I'm not the only historian that says he got that idea. Well, I'm not a historian, but anyway, I'm not the only person that has written he got that idea from the Iroquois Confederacy and what Canestego had told him a decade earlier. So, and do you want to, you know where the potato comes from, don't you? And you know where corn comes from, don't you? So Indian people have contributed a lot. And Thomas Jefferson, I mentioned this in my book. Jefferson was ignorant when he said this, but here's what he thought. He said, Indian people have the best government of all. None. Now, this shows how ignorant he was, though, because you all know no society exists for decades and centuries and millennia without some kind of social control mechanisms, some sort of police or law and order. And tribal communities practiced corporal punishment. Some tribes practiced capital punishment. You may be surprised, sir, to find out the Cherokee literally had a blood feud type situation. And they had, like the Bible tells us about the Israelites, cities of refuge. If you accidentally killed someone, their relatives had the right to kill you, the duty to kill you, unless you could get yourself to one of these neutral areas. This stuff is from a book by Raynard Strickland. He was dean at Oregon Law School for a while, but he's in Oklahoma. He just passed away literally this week. But his book, Fire and the Spirit, 1975, is where I'm taking this. And the subtitle is something, Cherokee Law and Governance, something like that. So Indian peoples were governments. They enforced law and order. I just got to say this because it came straight from Oregon, folks. There was an international outcry about 15 years ago, and maybe some of you will remember this. This might have been the Warm Springs tribe. They were going to reinstitute the whip master. Now, I just mentioned corporal punishment. In a lot of Indian communities, parents are very gentle and lenient. I don't know that there's belief in the, spare the rod, spoil the child. But some tribes had a whip master who would come over and discipline your child if it needed to be done. And that way you weren't doing it. And there was international outrage about this 15-year-old girl that was maybe going to be whipped. So you could find that on the internet in about 5 seconds looking for whip. So anyway, your question is so large, it would take volumes to write about. What have Indian peoples contributed? What are they still contributing? Right. The potato, corn, quinine, democracy. Because guess who came here? They were from aristocratic societies with kings and queens. And they got here and they think there were no kings and queens. There were tribal leaders that were carried around in litters down in the Mississippi Valley, the Natchez, and there were the burials of elites. Do you folks know about mound building cultures in the East? Most of us do not. There are more than 10,000 man-made mounds in the East that were burial for elites. And you dig into those mounds today and you find shells from 1,000 miles away. You find carven images. Anyway, I could go on for 3 more hours.
I'm afraid we are out of time, but you've got to come back. This has been fascinating, humbling, but fascinating, and also a dose of reality.